Good morning, Morai B'Rabotai, Bruchim Abayim. We're continuing on Masechet Succah, Daf Yud Aleph, Amud Bet, 9 lines up from the bottom of the Amud. Today's Amud is being learned as a Zchut Refuah Shelema for Esther Bracha Bat Chaya, Nisan, Nisim ben Miriam, and Rachel Simcha Bat Nahid. Today's Amud is also being learned as a Ilui Neshama for Avraham ben Ezra. Should have an Aliyah. This month's learnings of the community has been dedicated by the Shea family, Dayan family, Cohen families. Should be an ultimate zchut for all their mishpachot. Bezat Hashem. Amen. Okay, so we started the Mishnah in Yud Aleph, Amud Aleph, of what can be and what can't be the schach of the sukkah, and the last piece was introduction of schach not being able to be made from something that's mekabel tumah. We mentioned that there are 3 criterias for the schach. The schach has to be a davar shegidulo min hakarka, has to be something that grows out of the ground. It has to be detached from the ground, and it also has to be not mekabel tumah. So says our Gemara here, ze haklal, kol davar shemekabel tumah, anything that's mekabel tumah, you cannot use for schach. And the Gemara says, mena animili. How do you know? How do you know that I can't put a piece of my child's crib? It's all made out of wood. After all, it's gidulo min hakarka, it's beautiful, it's nice, it's fancy. Why can't they just be mesachech, put that wood on top of my schach? So says the Gemara, Amar Resh Lakish, Amar Kram, because Resh Lakish learns this from the pasuk, ve'ed ya'aleh min haaretz, that the cloud would come off from the earth. Ma'ed davar sheno mekabel tumah. Just like cloud is a davar sheno mekabel tumah, it is not susceptible to tumah. Cloud doesn't become tameh, and also is gidulo min haaretz, because it literally, the pasuk says ve'ed ya'aleh min haaretz. It will grow, it will come off from the earth. So af sukkah davar she'en mekabel tumah, sukkah also has to be something that is not mekabel tumah, vegidulo min haaretz, and it grows out of the ground. Now, says the Gemara, this is all good if you learn the schach of the sukkah from the clouds. And it's almost like backwards, the Gemara. The Gemara learns it from the cloud, and you're wondering to yourself, well, what does cloud have to do with schach of the sukkah? So the Gemara says, well, I understand this working according to the Mandamar, that we learn the schach of the sukkah from none other than ananei kavod, from the clouds of glory. So that makes sense why you're bringing cloud over here. Hanicha lemandamar ananei kavod hayu, that the Jews rested and were protected for 40 years in the Midbar by the means of the clouds of glory. Ela lemandamar sukot mamash asulahim. But if you tell me that the Jews actually made huts for themselves in the Midbar, in the 40 years of the travel they had in the wilderness, so who says that the schach, the ceiling of this hut, has to be eno mekabel tumah? I don't know what they used. Maybe they used the skin of animal. Maybe they used whatever they used. Research how the people made tents and huts 3,500 years ago. I don't know how they made it. Says the Gemara, if you tell me that they made their own private huts, then how do you know that it has to be eno mekabel tumah, the Tanya? How do we know that this is a machloket? What exactly the protection of sukkah was? We learned in the Braita machloket Tanaim. The pasuk says, "Ki basukot hoshavti et bnei Israel Hashem says, I sat you guys in Sukkot as I brought you out of Mitzrayim. Be'otzi otam me'eres Mitzrayim, ani Hashem. And says the Gemara, Anane kavod hayu. Divrei Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer says, this was Anane kavod. HaKadosh Baruch Hu protected us within his clouds of glory, and therefore we do the Sukkah zecher le'anane kavod. Le'ma'an yedu dorotechem ki vasukot hoshafti et bnei Yisrael v'otzi otam me'eretz Mitzrayim means anane kavod. Hashem, it was initiated by Hashem, it was anane kavod. Rabbi Akiva Omer, Rabbi Akiva says, no, Sukkot mamash asu lahem. They actually made Sukkot for themselves. Now, says the Gemara, Hanicha, the Rabbi Eliezer. It fits according to Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Akiva ma'ika lememar. But according to Rabbi Akiva, then what do you have to say? We don't know, according to Rabbi Akiva, that the schach of your sukkah has to grow out of the ground, has to be cut off from the ground, has to not be mekabel tumah, especially in our discussion here. So how do you know it? Now, by the way, in important parenthesis, Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Eliezer, who is the halacha like? Rabbi Akiva. Why? Because of two reasons. A, the Gemara in Eruvin says, halacha ke Rabbi Akiva mechavero. That means, whenever you have, this is Klalei HaShas 101. One of the major Klalei HaShas is, whenever you have a debate between Rabbi Akiva and one of his peers, halacha is like Rabbi Akiva. And then you have another element that halacha barely ever is like Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer vechavero, halacha kechavero. Why? Because Rabbi Eliezer Shemutihu is either from Bet Shammai. Let's look at Rashi tells us how to learn that. Or Shemuti means Shamta, he was put in Cherem, and someone that's put in Cherem, halacha is not like him. So Rabbi Eliezer, halacha should not be like him. Rabbi Akiva, halacha should be like him. And yet, if you open the tour in Siman Tafresh Chafei, and Shulchan Aruch, and all the poskim, they'll say, and even in the Shem Yichuds, for those Chassidish Yidden and the Sephardish Yidden, that they say the Shem Yichud before entering the Sukkah, you have it like mentioned 55 times, Zecher La'ananei Kavod. So we paskin like Rabbi Eliezer. How did that happen exactly? Now, there is a whole discussion to be had, to be completely honest intellectually, about the girsah, what the girsah exactly is over here, which maybe time allowing we'll discuss at some point. But there are those who say, for instance, the Onkelos, right? The Onkelos actually says, Zecher le'aranei kavod. When he translates Basukot Hoshafti et Bnei Yisrael, in this very pasuk that we just mentioned in Vayikra Chav Gimel, he translates it as the clouds of glory, that I brought you out of Mitzrayim and I provided for you Aranei Kavod. Hazaku Baruch. So now, Onkelos is very much the taich of the psukim, and the Gemara says that Onkelos Hager, the nephew of Titus, the emperor of Rome, who became a Ger Tzedek, as we learn every year in Masechet Gittin, who his Rebbe is Rabbi Yoshua and Rabbi Eliezer. So first of all, you would say, wow, that was very, very interesting, because it's Rabbi Eliezer Leshitato over here, right? He is the Rebbe of Onkelos Hager. So he's going, but it's not just Rabbi Eliezer. Anything that Onkelos said comes from Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yoshua. So already, now it's not just Rabbi Eliezer, it's also Rabbi Yoshua. And by the way, they are the Rebbes of, who else? Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva's primary Rebbeim were Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yoshua. And indeed, the Gemara in Baba Metzia Daf Nun Tet when they wanted to put Rabbi Eliezer in Shamta in Cherem, they said, who's going to go tell him, right? And Rabbi Akiva was chosen because he was so close with him, he was so beloved to him, and he was also wise how to say it to him in a way that would not be hurtful. We say this again in Masechet Sanhedrin, at the very end of Rabbi Eliezer's life. Rabbi Akiva and the other students are there. Rabbi Akiva was a primary student of Rabbi Eliezer and also Rabbi Yehoshua. But here you have now Rabbi Yehoshua. So, the issue of having halacha like Rabbi Eliezer, because he's shamuti, is no longer there because Rabbi Yehoshua also holds like that, right? And also, halacha ke Rabbi Akiva mechavero velo mechaverav is the second end of that klale hashas. Rabbi Akiva trumps one of an individual from his peers, but if you have chaverav that disagree with him, then halacha is not necessarily like Rabbi Akiva. So it kind of like takes the edge out of this question that this surprising question that we asked, just by taking a quick look at the onkelos. But the truth of the matter is, a person would wonder to themselves if he even makes a difference. Actually, one of the early Hasidic Rebbes in Sholetu Tshuvot Arugata Bosem, right? He actually is probably the first source that I know for the whole thing of optioning that people do for the kids at the age 3. Well, there's sources in Ariya Kadosh, but Ariya Kadosh took his son actually to Meron on Lag BaOmer. But that's, first of all, it's nothing to do with third birthday. It was on Lag BaOmer that he took him to Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, and also his son was like 5 years old, was certainly not 3 years old. So even though that the concept you see from Arizal, this whole thing that it was never our minhag, certainly not the Sephardi minhag, to do option, to do the halakha as they call it, it has evolved more and more as something that people do, and before you know it, it's going to be like Yarek Val Yavor. It's like, of course it says in the Torah, right? That's one of those things. How the minhagim evolve in a way that before you know it, people think that's mamash, like written in the Chumash. But nevertheless, the first source I know of it is in Tshuvot Arugat Bosem, Siman Rosh Yudah, I believe it is. But nevertheless, he writes, he says, wait a second, who cares? We do the sukkah anyways, right? Does it have any nafkamina? And he says like this, listen to this. He says, we don't paskin like Rabbi Eliezer because he's shamuti. Even though that the Gemara there says in Bava Metzia, the Gemara says that Rabbi Eliezer, when he took on the entire chevra, and you're talking about Rabbi Yeshua was the main bar plukta, but was Rabban Gamliel, everyone was against him. And he brought all the rayas, and they said, oh, that's not muchach, this is not muchach. So Rabbi Eliezer basically started miraculously proving his point. Said, if I'm right, the water should go backwards, right? If I'm right, the kotle bet midrash should fall. If I'm right, the tree should be upright. And finally, after all these miraculous miracle works, he says, if I'm right, bat kol yochiach. There should be literally a heavenly voice saying that I'm right. And lo and behold, the Gemara says, Yatzta bat kol, a heavenly voice came, said, Hanichu Eliezer beni sha'alacha kemoto. Leave Eliezer, my son, alone, because halacha is like him. Amad Rabbi Yehoshua al Raglav, Rabbi Yehoshua stands up and says, I'm not doing this for myself, I'm not doing this for the kavod of Bet Abba, but lo b'shamayimi. So Hashem, with all due respect, we love you, but you have already given us the Torah, and you've said lo b'shamayim. That means you cannot get involved with the psak. The psak halacha has its process of acharei rabim latot. We are the rabim, he's the yachid. Halacha is unclear, and the Gemara says they paskin like him. So says the Arugat Bosem, well, Batkol said halacha is like him. It's the only thing is, because of lo b'shamayim, we don't paskin like Hashem. We don't paskin like Shamayim, right? But really, if you don't have an issue of psak, right, Rabbi Eliezer carries a lot of weight. So therefore, he wants to say, this is like almost like Hasidic Torah. He says, therefore, in something that has no nafkamina ledina, when something has no difference in the halacha lemaaseh, we actually have no problem following Rabbi Eliezer, because who cares if he's shamuti, right? Especially after you see that he was right. Hashem said halacha kemoto. So therefore here, that the schach anyways is the same halacha of schach. What you are trying to remember, is it ananeh kavod we're remembering, or is it sukkot mamash asulaim? What's nafkamina? There's no nafkamina. So therefore, we pass it like a real yes. That's how he wants to say. But then he says, wait a second, I actually have a problem, because there is a halachic nafkamina. What is the halachic nafkamina? Says, if you pay attention, this is awesome, he says. 3 times in Torah and Shulchan Aruch, the Torah goes out of its way to explain to you why we do what we do. Right? He does it by tzitzit. He does it by tefillin. Tzitzit in siman chet. By tefillin in siman chaf hey. And you guessed right, by sukkah in siman taf resh chaf hey. The Torah goes out of its way to say that we sit in the sukkah to remember ananeh kavod, and it brings all these psukim that you have to do it. So it says, the Post actually very beautifully, it brings from the Bach. The Bach says this, the Bach asks this and brings this thing that 3 places in Shulchan Aruch, it goes out of its way to actually tell you why we do it. It says the criteria shared in all these 3 is that the Pasuk says Lema'an, in order to. Lema'an yed'u dorotechem ki basukot shafti, our Pasuk. Lema'an tiyeh Torat Hashem beficha, by tefillin, right? Leman tizkeru, by tzitzit. That, says the Bach, is coming to tell you the Torah is commanding you to remember why you're doing this. So the ta'am of the mitzvah becomes essential. So if you sit in the sukkah, you must remember why you're sitting in the sukkah. And mitzvot tzrichot kavanah. That's another aspect of it. At least in the mitzvot that are deoraita, you have to remember why exactly it is. You have to have kavanah, right? You can't just do the mitzvah without having kavanah. And therefore, says the Arukat HaBosem, it actually does have a halachic nafkamina. It's very important to know if it's Rabbi Eliezer or is it Rabbi Yoshua, because you're sitting in there, what are you remembering exactly? Well, Leman yedu dorotechem ki basukot shafti et bnei Yisrael. Now you have to understand the meaning of the pasuk. Is it aranei kavod, or is it sukkot mamash asulahem? So now it all of a sudden makes all the difference to know. And therefore, if we say that it was aranei kavod, it really is the halacha that you have to be thinking, and that I'm thanking Hashem and I'm commemorating and I'm reliving the experience of sitting Basila de Me'emnuta in the cell of the Sukkah. We remember the Ananei Kavod. So that becomes an important thing. But again, we do have, aside from reverting to Shinui Girsaot, and which again it's a serious thing. Many sources have this machloket in the reverse order. That means Rabbi Eliezer is the one that says Sukkot Mamash Asulay, Rabbi Akiva is the one that says that it was Ananei Kavod, which would answer our question to begin with. But nevertheless, even if you have our Girsa, you perhaps could salvage and save the day by the explanations that we gave. But nevertheless, we have now the Machloket Tanaim. We have Rabbi Eliezer, we have Rabbi Akiva, however you slice it. Is it Ananei Kavod? Is it Sukkot Mamash Asulahem? And the Gemara says, well, if you say Ananei Kavod was the source of the schach that we have, then I can understand, because Edi Alem Min Haaretz, the Ananei Kavod, the Anan to begin with, cloud, is not Mekabel Tumah, and is quote unquote Gidulo Min Haaretz. But if you tell me that they made their own private huts in the Midbar, then how do you know that the schach of the Sukkah can't be Mekabel Tumah? That's the question of the Gemara. So says the Gemara, Ki'ata, 3 lines up. Ki'ata Rabdimi, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. When Rabdimi came down from Eretz Yisrael, right? One of the Amoraim who had traveled to learn in Eretz Yisrael and now is back telling you what Rabbi Yochanan holds in everything. He said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Amar Kra, the Pasuk says, Chag HaSukkot Ta'aseh Lecha Shivat Yamim. Why does it say Chag HaSukkot Ta'aseh, right? So now, we have had this before that compares the Sukkah to Korban Chagiga, right? Chag is a reference to Korban Chagiga, as we had this also in Masechet Chagiga. And here we are actually reviewing the ramifications of that comparison of Sukkah, which means Schach, right? Whenever it says Sukkah means Schach, to Korban Chagiga. So says Rabbi Yochanan, Makish Sukkah leChagiga, is comparing your Schach to Korban Chagiga. Ma Chagiga davar she'enu mekabel tum'ah. A Baal Chai, a living being, is not mekabel tum'ah, right? It's not mekabel tum'ah. An animal is not mekabel tum'ah while being alive. So just like Korban Chagiga is not mekabel tum'ah, and it's also gidulo min haaretz, right? Sustained from the ground. He eats the vegetation and so on. Af sukkah davar she'enu mekabel tum'ah vegidulo min haaretz. Sukkah schach also has to be something that's not mekabel tum'ah, and it's gidulo min haaretz. It grows from the ground. Wait a second. That's very nice, but if you want to already go there, can I just dump some animals on top of my sukkah? Right? I'll be the schach. Maybe we should say the schach should be Baalei Chaim. Should be living animals, living beings. So that's the problem over here. That was Rab Dimi in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. So when Ravin, which is another Amorah that went to Eretz Yisrael and came back, when he came back from Eretz Yisrael, Kata Ravin Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Amar Kra, he said it a little bit differently. You know Rabbi Yochanan, Amar Kra be'osvecha mikornecha u miyikvecha. The pasuk says, Chag HaSukkot ta'aseh. You are making Chag HaSukkot, Shivat Yamim, 7 days, and the pasuk says, be'osvecha mikornecha u miyikvecha. Right? Now we know when we make Chag HaSukkot, right? It literally says the 15th day of the 7th month. So, thank you so much for telling me, why do I have to know that that's the time that I am gathering my crops from the field? In the same breath that you're telling me, make a sukkah. Must be, says Rabbi Yochanan, you're telling me how you make the sukkah. Chag HaSukkot ta'aseh, you make the sukkah. How? Migornecha umikvecha. From your goren and yekev. What's goren and yekev? Goren is your produce, right? The pile of your produce is goren, and yekev is from your vine, right? From your vineyard. So says the Gemara, said Rabbi Yochanan, Bepsolet goren veyekev hakatu medaber. The pasuk is speaking about the psolet, the leftovers of goren and yekev, which means the straws and the leftovers of your wine press. Okay, and those are not mekabel tum'ah, and they're gidulo min hakarka, right? So says Rabbi Yochanan, that's how I know what I have to use for my schach, because the pasuk gives me two examples that they share the same things. What do they share? They both grow from the ground. They both are not mekabel tum'ah.
What's the connection of this pasuk to Sukkot?
Chag HaSukkot ta'aseh lecha shivat yamim be'osvecha migornecha u'miyikvecha. This is the same pasuk says that in the same pasuk that says ta'aseh sukkah, you're making sukkah. The same pasuk says be'osvecha migornecha, that has to be migornecha u'miyikvecha, right? So says the Gemara. Okay, that's very nice, but ema goren atzmo ve'yekev atzmo. Who told you that this is talking about the straw and the leftovers of the wine press? Maybe it's talking about the wine itself. You know, what they talking about, like the clusters of grapes, which are mekabel tumah, by the way. Right? Food is mekabel tumah. Or, not the straws, the shaft of your grain, but the grain itself in the shaft. That means the bundles of wheat.
start.
Right?
Could be mixing pasul with kosher.
Well, the pasuk says yikvecha gornecha, right? Goren is your produce, and produce is mekabel tuma. Yekev is your clusters of grape, is your wine. So that is mekabel tuma. How did you just, improvise and say, well, this means the leftover of your wine press, and it means the straw of your grain? How do you do that? Says the Gemara, Amar Bzera, Yekev Ketiv. Says Rabbi Zera, Yekev Ketiv. It says Yekev. Yekev means not the clusters of grape, but it means wine. Right? You can't be mesachech with wine, so it must be that it's talking about the leftover psolit of your wine press, which is not mekabel tuma. So says the Gemara, just like it says Yekev, ve'i efshar lesachech bo, you can't create a ceiling with your wine, it will pour down. So it must be that you're talking about the Yekev, which is a leftover of your wine press, which is Gidulo Minaris and is not mekabel tuma. And that's what Rabbi Yochanan is saying. So says the Gemara, wait a second, that's even not true. Matkifla Rabbi Yirmiyah. Rabbi Yirmiyah says, I could make schach with wine. No, yeah, regular wine you can't be because it's liquid, but you could condense it. And actually, says the Gemara, they actually had this. Ve'ema yain karush haba misenir. Yain karush, the way they used to import wine from the city of Senir was like igule de vela. There was like the way they used to have a press for figs was they had like round pieces that was pressed, many hundreds of figs together, and that's how they transported it, that's how they dealt with it, that's how they sold it. And from the city of Senir, that's what they did with wine even. They would dehydrate it and press it to pieces, blocks of wine that was condensed and made to be like a solid block. So it says, put those blocks on top of your schach and you're good to go, right? What's the problem with that, says the Gemara? Amar, that looks like this fig blocks. Amar Rabbi Zera said, Ha milta ava biyadan, ve'ata Rabbi Yirmiyah, ve'shada be'narga. Right? This is Rabbi Yirmiyah that asked that you could have wine that is solidified to blocks of solid, dehydrated wine. So Rabbi Zera says, he ruined it. He ruined it. We thought we had the source for why you can't have a schach that is mekabel tum'ah, because of this pasuk that Rabbi Yochanan said, mikor necha u'mikvecha, and Yekev can't be wine. So it must be the psolit of wine. And came Rabbi Yirmiyah and ruined it by saying that no, it could be wine. So now we don't have a clarity exactly what the source is. Gemara says no. Rav Ashi himself, he explained how you know this according to Rabbi Yochanan from the pasuk of Migor Necha u'Mikvecha. Rav Ashi Amar, Rav Ashi said, Migor Necha v'lo Goren atzmo. It says Migor Necha, from your Goren, not with the Goren, but from your Goren, which means the straw. From your Yekev, not the Yekev itself, not the wine itself, but from your Yekev. From your Yekev, you know what that means? That means the pesolet of the wine press, which means those leftover pieces of the shell of the grapes and so on and so forth, which is left after the wine press. Velo Yekev atzmo, not the wine itself.
Question?
Yes.
I'm sorry. So if the wine itself is susceptible to tumor, why would anyone bring that as a possible source of?
No, he's rejecting this the possible source.
So now
We were saying before, we were trying to say before, you know where you know this from? Because the pasuk says Sukkot, Shchak HaSukkot Ta'aseh Shivat Yamim, make the sukkah, and it says Mi Yikvecha, right? And we were trying to push that Mi Yikvecha means the psolet, the leftover of the press, which would indicate that it is not mekabel tumah, it's not susceptible to tumah, and therefore you have a source that the schach has to be not susceptible to tumah. And came Rabbi Yirmiyah said, no, it could mean wine, and that is susceptible to tumah. So you have no source from this pasuk that the schach can't be susceptible to tumah. Rav Ashi kind of fixed it. He said, no. The pasuk says, mi yikvecha, not the yekev, not the wine itself. Mi yikvecha means the psolet of the wine press. So says the Gemara. Rav Chisda, Amar mehacha, he has a different source. Says Rav Chisda, this is a very beautiful Chag HaSukkot. It's very emotional Chag HaSukkot. Probably the most emotional Chag HaSukkot mentioned in Tanakh is in Psukim in Ezra, Nehemiah, and Perek Chet. They're talking about when the Jews were coming back to build the Beit Sheni together with Ezra and Nehemiah, and they had not done Chag HaSukkot for a while, and now they do it together. It's extremely emotional, beautiful. I had a lot to talk about this, actually, as Gishmak, just information for a different time maybe. But there it says, it actually instructs them, Nehemiah, and says, Se'u ahar, go to the mountains, ve'heviu ale zayit, go bring leaves of olives, ve'ale etz shemen, ve'ale hadas, ve'ale tmarim, right? You're bringing palm trees and olive trees and hadas, arava, everything, right? Amar Rav Chisda, and says the Gemara, ale etz avot, the Gemara says, we bring all of this, and the Gemara says, from here you see that all of the criteria that are necessary for the things that Ezra told them to bring they're all trees. For the sukkah, for building the sukkah over here, not just for arba minim, but you're building the sukkah, aka schach, and you see all of them are gidulo min haaretz, and they are not mekabel tumah, right? Leaves, branches, not mekabel tumah. So the Gemara, once being added, asks a simple question. It says, wait a second, you mentioned hadassin twice, right? You said hadas, and then you said etz avot, ale etz avot, which is also hadas. So hainu hadas, hainu etz avot. It's the same thing. Why do you mention it again? It is superfluous. Says the Gemara, Amar Rav Chisda, hadas shoteh lesukkah, ve'etz avot lelulav. Hadas shoteh, the one that's not hadas meshulash, it is for the schach. And etz avot, the ones who are kasher, are meshulash, is for your arba minim, for shaking lulav and etrog. So it says, the Gemara basically, Rav Chisda brought a proof from the pasuk in Nehemiah that you see that your schach has to be branches of trees, which is gidulo min hakarka, gidulo min haaretz, and also is not mekabel tumah. So we have three different ways to learn why the schach is not mekabel tumah, whether it is from ananak kavod or even if it is from sukkot mamash asulahem, the way we explained. And tomorrow, Be'ezrat Hashem, we will start the next Mishnah in Daf Yud Bet Amud Aleph. Chazak u'Baruch.